This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Ginkgo Biosecurity, whose cutting-edge biological intelligence platform empowers national security decision-makers to identify and respond to emerging biological threats.
I'm host Jeremy Bash with Beacon Global Strategies. Today, I'm joined by Jon Finer, the Principal Deputy National Security Advisor for the Biden administration. Mr. Finer previously served as Chief of Staff and Director of Policy Planning for former Secretary of State John Kerry during the Obama administration. Jon Finer joins us today for an exit interview, reflecting on the 4 years he served in the Biden White House, discussing some of the Biden administration's foreign policy accomplishments, and assessing the national security environment going forward into the Trump years. We'll be right back with that discussion after a break.
Biosecurity matters. What's biosecurity? It's the mission-critical industry safeguarding against 21st century biological threats. Biology doesn't respect borders. Ginkgo Biosecurity monitors critical assets and produces actionable biointelligence for national security decision-makers confronting biological threats, whether they are natural, accidental, or malicious. Ginkgo's technology tracks deadly pathogens worldwide, and our globally scaled platform, the first of its kind, detects outbreaks in near real time, deploys AI-powered threat assessments, and identifies the source of a threat, mitigating outbreaks before they become national emergencies. When lives and livelihoods are on the line, every second counts. Ginkgo Biosecurity, the biosecurity partner for an uncertain new era. Learn more at biosecuritymatters.com.
Welcome back. We're here with Jon Finer. Jon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, we're going to kick off this conversation, Jon, by talking about some of the key hotspots around the world, and would love your perspective on where you think the Biden administration left things as you departed office on January 20th of this past year. So maybe let's start with the Middle East, since you were so integrally involved with the ceasefire negotiations and the overall strategy of the Biden administration. Maybe you could just kind of take a step back and kind of walk us through how you see the Middle East in 2025.
Great. Thank you. Well, as you know, just as well as I do, the Middle East, when it comes to policymaking, is always this tug of war between promise and peril. And to be honest, I think that region often leans much further in the direction of peril than of promise. But by the end of 2024, I do think we were in a position where the level of opportunity and possibility in the region was beyond what I think I've seen in the last 15 years or so of working on the Middle East from a policy perspective. I also spent time in the region as a journalist before that for a few reasons. There are basically three big categories of issues that we were wrestling with. The first is the role of Iran. And I think in the post-October 7th period, the strategic position of Iran had been badly eroded through a combination of Israeli direct action, U.S. support for that direct action, sometimes very directly in terms of defending Israel twice from Iranian ballistic missile attacks, and then Israeli action again with the support of the United States against Iran's key proxies in the region, obviously Hamas, and I'll get to that in a second when it comes to Gaza, but also notably Hezbollah. And then Iran's primary ally in the region, Bashar al-Assad, who fell from power sort of unexpectedly and without a lot of foreshadowing in the midst of this post-October 7th period. So Iran strategically was left on the back foot in the region to an extent we have not seen in decades. Now, there is some peril behind that as well, which we can talk about more, including voices inside Iran increasingly saying, well, we may need to relook at the idea of whether we need a nuclear weapon, which would obviously be an incredibly dangerous development. But Iran is kind of one of the big strategic issues in the region that we think was left in a fundamentally stronger place than when we came to office in 2021. The second is Syria, where after a just grinding a civil war and a brutal period of decades-long rule by the Assad family, you have for the first time really in 40 plus years an opportunity for the Syrian people to be outside the yoke of this tyrannical oppression by the ruling family. Now, again, this is another one of these part peril, part promise situations. Because on the one hand, as I said, you have a moment to refashion the Syrian state to be inclusive of groups that have been marginalized in Syrian society. And to be free of this tyrannical dictator who had been running Syria for such a long time. On the other hand, some of the groups that are now involved in governing the Syrian state have a pretty checkered past and pretty checkered history, including some direct involvement with extremism and terrorism. So from a policy perspective, we've got to watch that very closely. But they have a chance now to put that country on a better trajectory than it's been on in quite some time, maybe ever in its modern history. The third area, obviously, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and in particular, in this case, obviously, the horrific war that broke out after the unconscionable attacks by Hamas on October 7th in Gaza. Now, there, too, by the end of our administration, and I have to say, candidly, in close coordination with the incoming Trump administration, we were able to establish, after many months of hard diplomatic work, a ceasefire that has started the process of releasing the remaining hostages from inside Gaza, putting in place a ceasefire that is allowing now massive influx of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, which has been badly needed for quite some time, and at least now creating the possibility of looking hard at what a future for Gaza can be like that involves neither direct Israeli occupation nor the rule of Hamas, which is the future I think most people in the region agree is the best case scenario for Gaza and ultimately for the West Bank. Now, that's the promise side. The peril side here is there are not good, easy answers to the questions of who is going to govern Gaza, who is going to provide security in Gaza. Will we be able to convert the first phase of this ceasefire into a permanent ceasefire, which comes in phase two? There's a lot of hard work still to be done. But here, too, I think certainly compared to the run up to the end of the year of 2024, we were able to leave that situation in a stronger place.
And it seems like President Biden was so personally invested in getting this ceasefire, and he was, I know, constantly, you've said, calling you and your colleague Jake Sullivan sort of on a daily, sometimes hourly basis, kind of saying, walk me through the progress and where can I help? But ultimately, from your perspective, kind of what unlocked the ceasefire? I mean, obviously, relentless U.S. diplomacy, maybe Israel's decimation of some of Iran's surrogates and proxies, and the activities against Hezbollah in the north, maybe the killing of Sinwar. I mean, what do you think were some of the things that kind of paved the way here?
So I think to some extent the calculus evolved over time on both sides. And by both sides, I obviously mean the negotiation was taking place through intermediaries, but fundamentally required Israel and Hamas to make a decision to establish the ceasefire. On the Israeli side, I think they accomplished their core military objectives in Gaza. And I think that was the case, starting in the summer and certainly heading into the fall, where having kind of moved systematically through the different regions of Gaza, they decided that their military objectives had largely been accomplished. Now, they didn't want to just stop at that point, because their very strongly held view, was that Hamas needed to be under military pressure in order to get Hamas to agree to make a deal. It is also true that starting in the summer and heading into the fall, Hamas was not willing to engage us, the other intermediaries, or Israel on actually establishing a ceasefire to end the war. So the other change in calculus that took place was on the part of Hamas, probably in part because of the pressure they were under from Israel, probably in part because their hope that there would be some outside intervention into the situation, either a big war in Lebanon or a regional war involving Iran that would shift Israel's focus away from Gaza and force Israel to maybe make more concessions to Hamas. All of that, given the success that Israel had militarily in those places, no longer looked like it was going to be the case. And I think that changed the Hamas calculus too. And then I have to say, the fact that the incoming administration said, and I think you can overstate this. I want to give them some credit because I think it's deserved. What I don't think is the case is that their, pressure on one side or the other was fundamentally different from ours. But had they said, hold off on this deal until President Trump takes office, I think that would have seriously complicated the attempt and the effort we were making diplomatically to get this deal done as quickly as possible. To their credit, they didn't make that political calculus. They decided they wanted the deal done ASAP, and that meant that it got done while we were still in office.
Great. And then turning to the Iran threat, you referenced the nuclear weapon debate inside Iran. So, I mean, again, if you're the Netanyahu government and you're thinking, what do I make of this new administration, and what do I fundamentally want from the United States, how do you see Israel's options with respect to the Iran nuclear program? How do you see the U.S.'s options unfolding?
So I think now several successive U.S. administrations have had as their declaratory policy that Iran will not be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. Certainly the Obama administration, which we both served, said that. The Trump administration obviously said that. The Biden administration has said that. And I think President Biden in some ways has been more explicit and more clear that the U.S. would take military action to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon if it got to that point. As you know, and probably as most people listening know, it is our government's assessment that Iran has not sought a nuclear weapon now for almost 2 decades, that they have in the past had a nuclear weapons program, that went on pause on the order of 20 years ago, and that Iran has not resumed that nuclear weapons program since then. But what you're seeing now, and for reasons that are not totally irrational, is a discourse, at least inside Iran, about whether that should be resumed. And I think it's happening because when a country's conventional military capabilities or deterrence are revealed to be lacking, and Iran's 2 core conventional capabilities were its proxies. We talked about Hezbollah and Hamas, how much weaker they are, and its ballistic missile program, which, having made 2 attempts at really hurting Israel, was revealed to be unable to do that in a direct way because of Israel's missile defense with the support directly from the United States. They are going to have to think about other ways of establishing, from their perspective, deterrence. And that's where the nuclear question comes in. Israel has had a military option vis-a-vis Iran's nuclear program for some time. They have not chosen to exercise that option for a range of reasons that would probably be best left for them to address. The United States also retains, we believe, a strong and very credible military option when it comes to Iran's nuclear program. But I think what would activate that question in a more serious way is if, rather than just a bunch of Iranian officials saying maybe we should, maybe we need a nuclear program, but actual steps in the direction of either weaponization or moving their enrichment from a level right now that is uncomfortably high at 60% across the threshold of 90%, which would be weapons grade. I think that would really call this question of whether somebody needs to step in and stop that program.
And one final question here, this is like the $1 million question as a policy advisor, policymaker, is given that Iran's missile defenses are down, or decimated or severely damaged, and given that they don't have a lot of other tools in their toolbox to retaliate, is this a time when we should sort of say tacitly or overtly, Israel, go for it. Take out as much of the nuclear infrastructure as you can. We may not participate directly, but we're okay if you do that. If you were in the Oval and someone was asking your opinion, how would you kind of frame up the options there?
So I think the only thing I'd say about this, and I will, in terms of what discussions we had in our administration or advice we gave the president, that's the one topic I tend to be pretty reserved about, and I think you understand why. Is on the one hand, Israel is a sovereign country. It will make its own decisions based on its own national interests as it perceives of them. And as I said, the idea of taking a military strike against Iran's nuclear program is something many different Israeli governments have looked at going back at least to 2010, 2011, when, by all kinds of public reporting, they were actively contemplating this. They've chosen not to. And I think part of the reason they have chosen not to is that, and this is, I think, a good general lesson for policymakers and policy advisors to contemplate, is every time you take a significant military action, you are unlocking potential consequences that you cannot fully foresee. And particularly a large, potentially destabilizing action like that in my view, should only be contemplated as a last resort to stop a nuclear program that is marching in the direction of a weapon. That's been U.S. policy now, again, across successive administrations of both parties. I think it remains, as far as I can tell, the approach that the current administration is taking, although I'd let them speak to that. But that to me seems like sound advice that both the government of Israel and the government of the United States have been following for quite some time.
John, let's turn now to Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, during the time that you served as Deputy National Security Advisor, we saw the largest land war break out since World War II on the European continental landmass. And as we headed into 2025, there were a lot of conversations about maybe the war's at a stalemate. Maybe this is a time when the new team coming in would try to drive the parties to the table. But we have been providing military assistance to Ukraine, and they have thwarted Russia's ultimate ambitions, which was to drive to Kyiv and decapitate the regime and totally take over Ukraine and deprive Ukraine of a security relationship with the West. And so how do you assess kind of where things stand on the battlefield, but then on the larger strategic picture?
So I'm glad you asked the question in the way you did, because I think too often here in Washington, when I get asked questions about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it is a question that is devoid of context. Russia made X, Y, or Z gain on the battlefield in the last week. Does that foreshadow, Ukraine ultimately being on a path to losing the war? And I think it is very important to take a step back, as you just did, and remind ourselves that 2+ years ago, when this war began, now, going on almost 3 years ago when this war began, the broad swath of expert commentary was about how quickly all of Ukraine could be swallowed by Russia, including obviously Kyiv, the capital. We're not talking about that anymore. We're talking now about incremental advances in the far east of Ukraine. And there is some evidence that Russia in recent months has made some incremental gains, but we're talking about, again, a small percentage of what is a vast, geographically speaking, country. And 3 years ago, if you had told, I think, the leaders of Ukraine, certainly I can speak for myself as a U.S. official who's looking hard at this, that this is the problem set that we'd be facing 3 years on, I would consider that to have been a pretty successful situation. And I think we were successful, and Ukraine, ultimately, first and foremost, was successful for a few reasons. First, everybody underestimated how well the Ukrainian military would fight. Their will to fight, their capability to fight. But they didn't do that alone. And the United States and our allies stepped up with a massive level of support beyond anything I think the United States has provided to another country during a conflict in which we were not directly involved. And it started not just in February of 2022 when Russia launched this new invasion, but well before that. We started to build them up once we identified the intelligence that suggested what Russia was going to invade. And at every step along the way, we have provided them, we think, with what they needed to succeed on the battlefield, such that, again, the battlefield situation is not comfortable for Ukraine. They are taking large numbers of casualties, and maybe they are eroding in a very incremental way some of the ground that they have taken back from Russia in the east, but at an enormous cost to Russia. 1,000, 1,500 or more casualties a day in a recent period. Over a 2-week period of this conflict in the fall, Russia was losing as many dead and wounded as the United States lost in the entire Iraq war over a 2-week period. So that is a remarkable cost that Russia is paying. We also have imposed a significant economic cost on Russia. I think people tend to focus on some of the wrong indicators. They look at, economic growth and things that can be covered up by Russian government spending. But we are robbing, and our allies are robbing, through our sanctions, through our export controls, Russia from having a modern, future-oriented economy. There's no country in the world, whether bigger or smaller in terms of economic strength than Russia, that would want to emulate the current composition of the Russian economy because we have imposed such constraints on it. And so you look at that combination of things, and by the way, we have used Russian sovereign assets to bolster the Ukrainian economy. $20 billion was transferred based on the proceeds from Russian sovereign assets to the government of Ukraine, and another $20 billion will be transferred by the Europeans over the period of months, also based on Russian sovereign assets that have been frozen in the West. So you look at that whole picture, and what we handed to the incoming administration was a chance to achieve a peace for Ukraine that is just, that is on acceptable terms to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government. But it is going to take continued strength and pressure and consistency of approach. Whether or not they choose to continue down this path and try to bring about a negotiation that ends the war on acceptable terms or choose a different path remains to be seen.
And were we fundamentally in the situation where our public posture had to be, we're for whatever Zelensky's for? In other words, if he wants to keep fighting and drive a harder bargain, get leverage, we're for that because we're fundamentally backing him. But maybe behind the scenes, there were earnest conversations about what could he live with, what would be the terms of such an agreement, and particularly what would be the security arrangements between Ukraine in the future and, say, NATO or the Ukraine and the United States.
So, look, what I would say about this is if I were President Zelensky, I think I would have handled the public messaging around the conflict in a very similar way to how he handled it. There were often times when he would come out and express dissatisfaction with the level of support he was being provided and declare that he was never going to negotiate anything less than every single inch of Ukrainian territory coming back from Russia, and any other terms would be not worthy of discussion. That was their position, and very understandable in both cases. What I will say, though, is when it comes to U.S. support and assistance, we had a mantra that was more than just a mantra. It actually, I think, was a moral position as much as a strategic position, although it very much was both, that the United States was not going to compel Ukraine or try to compel Ukraine, which is a sovereign country, and part of what we're standing up for here is their sovereignty, to negotiate either before they were ready or on terms that were unacceptable to them. And so, I think the big open questions in any negotiation, and would not surprise me at all if these questions were called during the course of 2025. I think that would have been the case probably no matter who won the U.S. election, that 2025 was likely to be a year in which significant negotiations took place. One territory, as you said, is one side or the other or both willing to make concessions related to territory. And by the way, it's worth remembering Ukraine is now fighting on Russian territory too, in Kursk, and that was another thing that was unthinkable a couple years ago. And two, as you say, what sort of security guarantees and arrangements must Ukraine have, and does Ukraine deserve, in order to feel like its sovereignty will be protected not just this year but in perpetuity? Our answer to that, quite clearly, was that Ukraine should eventually become a member of NATO, and was on a path to doing that, sort of, as we described, a bridge to NATO membership. There may be other possible models for providing Ukraine with those security guarantees, but unless the hard questions of territory and security can be addressed, even if you launch a negotiation, it won't be successful. So that is what they'll have to work through this year.
We're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back with more of our discussion with Jon Finer.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
A key Biden administration accomplishment was the expansion of NATO, and I would argue the overall strengthening of strategic transatlantic ties. And if you could just comment on that, how did President Biden, who I always thought throughout his career in the Senate was a transatlanticist, how did he kind of direct you to undertake that important objective?
It's just one of these strange things where you come into a job, now a little more than 4 years ago, as I and the other colleagues on our team did, and would have never predicted that one of the significant things that would come out of these 4 years would be a significant expansion of NATO to two countries that had not publicly contemplated NATO membership in quite some time, Finland and Sweden, and then did so for all of the obvious reasons based on Russian action. So yeah, that was a very significant step, because what it said was, and there's a lot of other evidence in addition to this, that Russia's attempt to achieve this great a tactical surprise and strategic victory of a conquering Ukraine, which was their goal, was actually going to result in shifting the strategic balance dramatically against them because of the cost that they are paying in Ukraine, because the alliance, which they consider to be their number one security threat, has now grown, including more than 1,000 miles along their border. In a way that they are not as well postured to defend because they are so embroiled in Ukraine. So it's really created this security dilemma for Russia that is entirely of their making. And the fact that the alliance, rather than fracturing, which many people might have predicted, or squabbling about how to handle Russia going into Ukraine, stayed unified, got even somewhat reluctant countries to support expansion to 2 new members, I think is a remarkable accomplishment.
It certainly is. I want to just pivot to Asia, to use a phrase. But before we do that, as we think about the threat posed by geopolitical competitors, great powers, Russia, and ultimately, as we'll talk about, China, there is increasingly coordination between several of our adversaries. The acronym I heard recently was CRINGE: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and global extremists. And you've got Iranian drones on the battlefield in Ukraine. You've got North Korean troops in Ukraine, although they might be being sidelined now. And you've got a no limits pact between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin on the eve of the Ukraine invasion. So just talk a little bit about how all of these bad guys are working together.
Yeah. So, by the way, I'm going to avoid the acronym CRINGE, which makes me cringe a little bit to hear. But the phenomenon that you've described is very real, and I think worthy of serious analysis. So, what you have, the concerning story, is that there is increasingly this alignment among core adversaries of the United States and Western, and by the way, Indo-Pacific allies. And what it has resulted in is somewhat of a linking of different kind of theaters of operation in the world. So as you said, we've got now North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian troops on Russian soil against the Ukrainian army. We also have Iran and by the way, North Korea also sending just massive amounts of material and weaponry to the Russians now for multiple years of this conflict, maybe the biggest military backer of the Russian army during this period. You also have Iran. We were talking about all the different complexity and turbulence in the Middle East. Even during that time, pre and post October 7th, Iran continuing to ship its own weapons and material to Russia. So Russia, which had these 2 client states, Iran in the Middle East and North Korea in the Indo-Pacific, is now, the sort of balance of power has shifted, is now basically leaning on these 2 countries for help during its own, what it considers to be a quasi-existential war. But that has really linked the Middle East and Europe and the Indo-Pacific in a way that is concerning because you start to wonder that if this escalated, where it could ultimately lead. And so it's something that we watched very carefully and tried to limit to the extent possible the expansion of the Ukraine conflict to pull in these other regions as well. But the question that really needs to be asked here is, why is this happening? It is not happening because Russia is in a position of strength. Or because Iran and North Korea are in positions of strength. And we should talk about China in a minute, which is part of this adversary alignment story, but I think from a slightly different angle, because they are trying as hard as they can not to go all in with those 3 countries, but to maintain economic and other security ties to other parts of the world, including Europe and even including the United States. So they are not full on part of this, but are certainly part of the story. They are doing this because they are increasingly isolated. All of those countries, North Korea, Iran, Russia, they are isolated diplomatically, they are isolated economically, and so they are turning to each other by necessity, not because they are strong and drawn to other countries in a position of strength. And I think it's important to point that out as well.
So let's talk about China and the PRC leadership's ambitions and Xi Jinping's ambitions. Some have described Xi Jinping as a destiny thinker, someone who believes it's the destiny of China under his leadership to reunify China, take Taiwan, and that he understands that there are going to be economic complications along the way, but that's kind of not his principal concern. First of all, do you assess that China under Xi Jinping's leadership still would like to take Taiwan and reunify it with the mainland? And if so, what does that look like? And then obviously, importantly, how did the Biden administration try to deter that, prevent that from happening?
So I'll answer the Taiwan question, but just taking a half step back, because we've talked about kind of the U.S. strategic position in the world from the perspective of the Middle East, principally vis-a-vis Iran, and in Europe, vis-a-vis Russia. And I've at least tried to make the argument that both Russia and Iran have been left strategically weaker, and the United States and our allies strategically stronger in those two regions over the last 4 years. The third piece of this story, or the third leg of this stool, really is China. When we came to office, and I remember this vividly, the dominant narrative was that the United States was on the cusp of being surpassed economically in terms of sort of high-end national security relevant technologies, and in terms of just influence in strategically important parts of the world by China. Very few people are telling that story now, and there's a whole range of reasons for that, many due to sort of missteps the Chinese have made, overplaying their hand diplomatically, mismanaging their own domestic economy. But China is no longer on a path to surpass the U.S. Economy, no longer on that trajectory. And I would argue that due to some of the work our administration did in the Indo-Pacific, bolstering our ties to the Japanese and the Koreans bilaterally and trilaterally, raising the Quad to the head of state level, investing the Indians in some of our work in East Asia, alongside Australia and Japan, enhancing our relations with other swing voters in that system, Vietnam and the ASEAN countries. We really enhanced the strategic position of the United States at a time when China was on the back foot, unable to respond effectively. And we did that without destabilizing our bilateral relationship with China to the point that we were or had to be concerned about conflict, because it's been a core position of this administration, and I think will be the case for the next administration, that a China-U.S. conflict is in no one's interest, neither of those two countries and the world. So we put the guardrails on that relationship that allowed it to be stable, even as we competed with them relentlessly, strategically, and economically, and in other ways. So where does that leave them vis-a-vis Taiwan? Look, I will not sit here and pretend that Beijing's ambitions toward Taiwan have changed at all in recent years. I don't think they have. Reunification continues to be a sort of core strategic goal. Our position is also quite clear. We do not believe the status quo when it comes to Taiwan or cross-strait relations should be altered unilaterally or by force. That means, by the way, we do not support a unilateral declaration of independence by Taiwan, and it certainly means we do not support the PRC altering the status quo through some sort of either full-on invasion or other scenarios that people now muse about, a blockade or quarantine of Taiwan to try to force concessions by strangling its economy, the taking of smaller pieces of territory in Taiwan, maybe a small island or something along those lines. Obviously, completely reject all of those. And our approach has been consistent with decades of bipartisan U.S. commitments, including in our own statutes, to build up Taiwan's ability to defend itself, which we have done relentlessly during the course of the 4 years of the Biden administration, and maintain a posture of strategic ambiguity with regard to exactly what the United States would do in the event of a contingency, while continuing to engage the PRC and make clear to them that we fundamentally wholly reject military coercion when it comes to this scenario or others in the Indo-Pacific.
So we have turned Taiwan into a porcupine, or we're continuing that project to deter any military effort to retake Taiwan by force. We're bolstering our allies' capabilities. We're bolstering our own force posture. We're investing in new technologies such as AUKUS and submarine capabilities. Will this work, do you think? I mean, will this work both to protect Taiwan's independence, deter China, bolster our allies, and protect our core values and interests in the Indo-Pacific?
So ultimately, the measure of whether this quote unquote works is going to be, does Taiwan essentially maintain its current status? And not just for a year or for a few years, and everybody has 2027 in their mind, but there's no magic to that deadline. Something could happen sooner than that. Something could happen well after that. And so I think the only way to be confident that the answer to your question, did this work, will this work, is yes, is to maintain and enhance the approach, again, that bipartisan administrations have taken. Build a chorus of diplomatic rejection of any sort of PRC unilateral military intervention or military coercion short of a direct intervention. And as you said, we now have a lot more countries in the world that talk about cross-strait relations than we used to. It is now a staple facet of statements from multilateral bodies, including, by the way, NATO, which never used to talk about PRC at all, let alone talking about Taiwan. It used to be very hard to get the Japanese to talk about Taiwan. They are now increasingly vocal, as are countries like the Philippines, the Indians, and the ASEAN countries. And I think part of that is everybody having an increasing sense that the PRC has demonstrated a degree of aggression that makes them nervous about their own circumstances. And some of that is diplomatic work we have done to elevate this issue. So raise the cost, the perceived cost diplomatically, raise the perceived cost militarily by, as you say, strengthening Taiwan's ability to defend themselves, which we have done in very significant ways, I would argue beyond what any administration has done over the last 4 years. And then the other piece of this is economic, because any sort of conflict between the PRC and Taiwan would have massive implications for the global economy. It's a big part of the reason why everybody would like to avoid anything along these lines. But I think the demonstration effect of what the world has collectively done to sanction and impose export controls on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine is something that will at least enter into the thinking, enter into the calculus of PRC leaders, and really only one leader is of consequence for this conversation when they think about the future of Taiwan.
So when we look back at the Cold War and we think about a big competition between the United States and our major rival, the USSR was a political and military rival, but not so much an economic or technology rival. I mean, they were a technology rival during the Sputnik era, but from an economic perspective, no one was looking at the Soviet Union's economic model saying, gee, I'd like to have bread lines in my country. With China as the rival now, though, there is this question about whether China's economic power, maybe its investments in infrastructure, in all of these swing states around the world, that's what we're kind of going up against. I think it's part of the reason why President Biden traveled to Africa at the end of his term and wanted to highlight some infrastructure projects that the United States was creating. Can you talk a little bit about the competition along economic lines? And then I want to also talk about the technology competition with China as well.
Sure. So I think you're right that at the height of the Cold War, the United States felt like we were in an existential kind of military competition with the Soviet Union, had to close any gaps and surpass them in core ways, and that's what led to arms races and also diplomatic agreements that were reached to try to put some limits on that competition. When it comes to China, we are both competing with them militarily, although there it's really China that is trying to close gaps, real and perceived, with the United States. I don't think anybody believes, including PRC leaders, that they have fully closed those gaps, but they are now, according to our own Pentagon, our nearest sort of peer rival militarily. But we also have, as you say, this competition of models that I don't think the United States worried about as much during the Cold War. With the Soviet Union, I think the United States felt like the bulk of the rest of the world, if you had to give them the choice between living like Soviets or living like Americans, would have chosen to live like Americans. I still think the United States has the more appealing, dominant model in terms of the perceptions of the rest of the world, but we have to acknowledge is a much closer call in this era of competition than it was before. And, I think in recent years, increasingly, you saw some countries start to think, well, maybe there is some appeal to a more autocratic form of government coupled with a market-ish economy that generates, year after year after year of relentless high growth. That, too, though, story has started to erode for the PRC in recent years. And so, I think, as I said, when we got here in 2021 and all anybody could talk about was the inevitability of China surpassing the United States, that model looked a lot better than it does at a time when the United States is actually the number one now engine of global growth, both compared to our Western peers and compared to significant Asian and Indo-Pacific economies, including China. And so I think we are now in a stronger place to compete from the perspective of that form of soft power. Does our model seem more appealing to theirs? Now, where we've always struggled to keep up is one thing that China can do that the United States can't is just direct enormous resources at other countries to try to buy their favor, extract from them kind of core resources that fuel its economy. And that's Belt and Road. We don't have state-owned enterprises we can just say, go and set up shop in X, Y, or Z country. We don't have a sovereign fund that we can dedicate, although there was an announcement just today about the possible establishment of one, not something the United States currently has in its toolbox. And so in our administration, we try to think about, okay, how do we compete on that level? Because what countries really want from us, some of them want security guarantees or defense sales. Some of them want humanitarian or development assistance. Although what I think we hear the most from countries whose favor we are trying to gain is what they want is investment. They want steps that the United States can take to help enhance their economies in a very direct way. And that means our private sector. So the real strategic advantage the United States has over China and everybody else is a dynamic, innovative, attractive private sector. So how do we extract the value of that strategically with these other countries when we can't tell them what to do? That's to some extent the Angola story that you alluded to a second ago, which is in a few consequential parts of the world, Angola being the best recent example of it, we have turned our economic tools, our Development Finance Corporation, our Millennium Challenge Corporation, our Export-Import Bank, and told these entities, use the tools that you have to incentivize private sector activity, investment in areas of strategic consequence for the United States, and we will use that to improve our relations with those places and compete increasingly with China. And so when the president went to Angola, he was able to announce a project that was some U.S. public dollars, massive private sector dollars that followed those U.S. Public dollars. So the vast majority of the funding came from the private sector to build a rail, data, energy corridor across the entire continent of Africa, from Libido port in Angola to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, that would link these countries and enable them to trade and interact with each other in ways that has never been possible up till now. And it was the result of, I think, some very creative thinking about an investment-focused way of relating to the rest of the world.
John, one of the Biden administration's, I think, signature achievements has been acknowledging the important merger of economic, technology, and national security issues, and pursuing an industrial strategy that advances America's economic competitiveness, including with the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act and other investments, but also kind of quickly getting your arms around this new phenomenology with respect to AI, large language models and generative AI, so that the United States can be the global leader. And we've seen in recent weeks China's advancements in their AI. And I wanted to get your reflections on how we as a country can continue to be the technology leader in the world, and what do you see as the Biden administration's kind of signature approach there?
So before we even got to thinking about kind of how we were going to structure our foreign policy or what we were going to try to accomplish in the world during the 4 years of our administration, the president very clearly identified that the job one, the most important piece of business we had, was to strengthen the U.S. domestic economy as we were coming out of these doldrums caused by the pandemic that obviously began in the previous administration and spread into the first year at least of the Biden administration. And that meant, from the perspective of the president, not just some big influx of money that would be spent in a non-strategic way, but using this moment of crisis to regenerate what he considers to be the core of U.S. domestic economic power and, frankly, the core of our national security power and influence in the world, which is rebuilding the U.S. industrial base, including manufacturing, but with a focus on these industries that are going to define the future. So not only did you see a massive infrastructure bill very early in this administration that passed through Congress, but you also saw the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest government expenditure anywhere in the world that's focused on developing clean energy in the United States. You saw the Chips and Science Act, which was designed to resurrect what was a very flagging semiconductor manufacturing capacity in the United States. All of these are both inputs that strengthened our domestic economy in the near term, but also investments in what the president believed and we believed were going to be the industries that design the future, that define the future and allow the United States to compete. So you made these foundational investments. From our perspective, our little corner of this at the National Security Council, we identified, I think for the first time, that this work, which I don't remember talking a whole lot about during the Obama administration, don't remember talking a lot about the implications of emerging technologies, was increasingly going to be at the center of everything we did. So we created a directorate, a group of, call it a half dozen technology and national security experts in-house at the NSC to try to help structure those pieces of legislation and take advantage of them to enhance our national security. Two pieces of this. There is promoting our own capabilities in the United States, and that gets to your comment about AI, making sure that the best AI scientists and research was being done in the United States and working very closely with the labs that were doing that, but also defending and restraining where necessary, defending our technology from our adversaries' attempts to acquire it, and preventing them from being able to take things that were made here or pioneered here and use them against the United States. For decades, many of these core American technologies were being sold without any restraint to countries in the world that could wish or do wish to do us harm. We have not fully put a stop to that, but we have massively constrained that ability, particularly when it comes to China and advanced semiconductors and the tools that make them, but also when it comes to a Chinese attempt to acquire sensitive data on American citizens, and a whole range of other inputs to their industrial base that could have allowed them to compete on the level of the United States. So it is hard to overstate the amount of time that we on the national security side of the House spent working on these issues that traditionally, historically, have really been handled by a different part of our government. A sort of domestic policy, economic policy, insulated to some extent from national security thinking. That is now fully integrated across our government, was at the very core of what we did. And frankly, the structures that we put into place and have now handed off, we believe, have set us up to compete very effectively in the years to come.
Jon, there's so much more to talk about. We're going to have to wrap up in a moment here. We're going to have you back to talk about things like the accomplishments you had with respect to counterterrorism, making Americans safer from extremist organizations, taking out some of the final remnants of al-Qaeda, maintaining an over-the-horizon capability as we withdrew from Afghanistan, and dealing critical blows to ISIS. We should probably talk about cybersecurity at some point, because you really we're dealing with a massive set of cyber challenges at the beginning. I know that's been a big focus of the NSC, and some of the pioneering work you've done with respect to the space and space architecture as commercial space has become a dominant feature in that domain. So there's so many things to talk about, including military readiness and some of the intelligence capabilities you've pioneered. I also, as you know, work with you on countering fentanyl from the position of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, where we saw the President issue a national security memorandum upgrading the capabilities of the intelligence community and working with law enforcement to combat fentanyl. So, Jon, there's a lot more to talk about, but I want to ask you in conclusion, take us through kind of a typical day on the NSC. As you look back at the last 4 years, what was your day like? What time did you get to the office? Tell us about when would you see the president? What would you and Jake do all day? And then when you put your head on the pillow at night, kind of how much sleep did you get before you had to do it all over again?
It's funny. I'm smiling here because I'm sitting here in jeans and not a suit for the first time in quite some time, having had a day in which I was like Ubering all over Washington to try to meet people for different conversations about the future, and it is quite a contrast to my normal day in government in a range of ways. You know, I get picked up 7 o'clock in the morning. I'd be at work till about anywhere between 8:30 and 9:30 at night, and basically my entire day was spent in one of three small rooms. Either my office, which I think you have been to and you can vouch for the fact is good real estate in terms of location, very bad real estate in terms of size. But a lot of my day in that office,
in the West Wing,
on the phone, on my computer, responding to the literally hundreds of emails that come in. In the Oval Office, where we do the daily brief every day with the president, and that is just hugely valuable time because it's where we get updated by the intelligence community on everything that's happened in the world over the last 24 hours or so, as well as any breaking analysis that they want to pass on. But also it's our opportunity to have a give and take with the boss, get his guidance, give our advice about the way ahead on any number of policy issues. And so we would spend a good anywhere from 30 minutes to more than an hour sometimes, to the chagrin of the people who manage the president's time, talking that stuff through. And we were fortunate to have a president who was deeply knowledgeable about all of that and very interested in having those conversations. So that was highly valuable time that we structured our entire day around. And then the rest of the day was really spent in policy conversations. In my role, as the Deputy National Security Advisor, I convened our interagency participants, the CIA, the Defense Department, USAID, Treasury Department, State Department, to talk about whatever decisions had to be made or crises that had to be managed. And crisis management was just a huge part of the last 4 years, just given how turbulent the world was. I think I convened something on the order of 800 or 900 of these meetings over the course of 4 years, which is a number I'm a bit embarrassed about, candidly, because people always talk about how there are too many meetings, but there was a lot going on. And so convening those discussions to try to set the direction for the entire government on the core issues we faced. You add to that mix, sometimes you have a foreign counterpart in town and, you do a diplomatic conversation with them in your office or somewhere else. Sometimes you do engagements with the press. And then, you look up and all of a sudden it's 7:30, and that's when we usually had our wrap-up meeting at the end of the day, for a half hour or 45 minutes. And then you go back to your computer and realize there's like 50 emails you haven't answered before you head home for the night. So there's a lot of variables that can play into that, but that is a typical day, and it's very different in ways that I'm not entirely unhappy about from the day I had today, let's just say.
Well, Jon Finer, Principal Deputy National Security Advisor to President Biden, I think the nation owes you a debt of gratitude for your career in public service, in particular for these last 4 years, which were certainly full of challenges. We appreciate you joining us here on Intelligence Matters, and we look forward to having you back sometime soon.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. And by the way, same to you, including for some of the work you did during our administration, and it was great to be here.
Thanks, Jon. That was Jon Finer joining us on Intelligence Matters. I'm Jeremy Bash. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.